Welcome to another episode of Research at the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy. I'm Laura Bullon Cassis, postdoctoral researcher at the Centre. This episode will deep dive into the field of environmental justice through ethnographic ways of knowing, with a focus on supranational sites of governance. Joining us today is a distinguished guest, Jennifer Telesca, Associate Professor of Environmental Governance in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment of Radboud University, the Netherlands. Jennifer's work looks at the heart of what shapes our relationship with our environment. It takes a critical approach to ocean studies, spanning the interests of environmental diplomacy, ethnographies of international law, the human-animal relationship, political economy, and the politics of extinction. She conducts fieldwork at the United Nations, diplomatic missions, and other sites scaled supranationally. In this episode, we'll venture into the evolving landscape of environmental justice and discover how it informs Jennifer's anthropological perspective and vice versa. We'll discuss extractivist methodologies and how ethnography enriches our understanding of governance in the context of international organizations. So thank you for joining us, Jennifer. Your work as an anthropologist in the realm of environmental justice is truly noteworthy. So we're really happy to have you here on this podcast. So environmental justice is a field that's been evolving rapidly. Can you tell us how you see the field evolving and how this impacts your work as an anthropologist?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Laura, for having me. I think it's probably best to actually back up a little bit and just more broadly, especially for listeners that may not have a clear sense of what environmental justice means, to just very briefly establish the field of study, the field of action, which basically means that the most marginalized among us, that is, the ones with the least access to the levers of power, are disproportionately impacted by the environmental crisis. So, in effect, the ones that are least responsible are the most impacted. How to achieve environmental justice, though, takes different forms or approaches. So some people think procedurally and want a seat at the decision-making table. Others want to punish the polluters. Others want to redistribute the wealth, recognize harm. Right? So there's various ways to achieve it. But nonetheless, I think what all environmental justice advocates acknowledge is that these harms are produced by a system that disproportionately impacts the marginalized among us. So, briefly, if this is a help, just to show how the movement is evolving, I think maybe it's also worth thinking through its brief history. I think it's important to note that the last public act of Martin Luther King Jr. before his assassination in 1968 was a march with Black sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. And part of what I think is important here is the recognition that there was already by the late 1960s a recognition that people's bodies, and not just pristine natures, are also subjected to pollution. And these are bodies who are disproportionately poor, concentrating in communities of color, but they lack political power and thus cannot claim "not in my backyard," right? That NIMBY phrase that you commonly hear in the environmental justice movement. So briefly, if you were, fast forward, you have a movement that pretty much lagged for well over a decade until the early 1980s, when in Warren County, North Carolina in 82, there was a discrete movement in order to protest the siting of a hazardous waste landfill. And this was really in recognition that at this moment, you start to see the establishment of these two streams. So on the one hand, you have a mainstream environmental movement concerned with saving whales, dolphins, rainforests, the California spotted owl. And then you have another movement that is also concerned with the safety and lack of toxicity in where people live, work, and play, like amongst people, right? So they're like ships passing in the night for decades. And it's not until, maybe 10 years ago, but within the last decade, that you're starting to see the coming together of these movements, which now leads me into a more direct answer to your question, which is, I think there's two things going on. So on the one hand, the mainstream environmental movement can no longer get away with
ignoring the calls of environmental justice as traditionally defined. Right? So there's still a tremendous amount of work to do, but I think it is very significant that the former head of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Ben Jealous, is now the executive director of the Sierra Club. This is a major development, and I think shows a growing recognition that as the environmental justice movement encourages us to think that these problems are systemic, right? They're rooted in the very organization of our institutions, which themselves are culturally made and defined. And I think the second major development is also an increased effort to include the non-human, not only at the level of ethics, right? So should I eat meat? But rather at the level of politics, right? So how to incorporate the more than human as subject and not as mere object in decision-making. And indeed, we still have a very long way to go, but I think there is a realignment happening, provided environmental justice is leveraged to address the inequities that are produced by a system that's enabling harm. So, that said, while environmental justice is increasingly understood as a global movement, every country worldwide falls short of achieving its aims for all beings. I think, and this really gets at the secondary part of your question, which is how does all of this impact my work as an anthropologist? And so for me, environmental justice is undoubtedly felt and experienced locally, at the workplace, along a polluted highway, right, in a slaughterhouse, but less analyzed is the degree to which environmental injustices emanate from the very globally governing bodies that are entrusted to care for the planet and its people and its other beings. And this is precisely what I've observed when participating in fora dedicated to ocean governance. Right. So you see the way in which it's the very process of rulemaking that reproduces a system that effectively favors the rich and powerful. And at least in the realm of ocean governance, it is very human-centric.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Let me jump in on that and ask you, so what does ethnography bring to a study of these global organizations, international organizations, that other methods, other approaches, like a semi-structured interview, cannot? And how does the work of an ethnographer differ from, say, the work of a journalist, for those who might not be familiar with the method?
Yeah. So, sometimes there's a tendency to think that ethnography is kind of like glorified people watching, like I'm a professional people watcher, or, maybe a glorified journalist who helicopters in, but that's certainly not how I conceive of the work. So ethnography, for listeners that may not know what this is, so this is a method, participant observation, that implies extended time in the field, right? So time in the field is necessary to discern patterns, right? So under this view, going to a meeting or two is really not enough in order to be able to discern those patterns and to be able to predict, in some respects, so what's going to happen next, or to be able to see when there's a break from normal procedure. And both are quite revealing. And then, I'm also not a journalist to the extent that I'm armed with social and political theory, not deductively, but inductively, meaning that I try to discern those patterns based on what I see happening on the ground. And it's those patterns that later get married to the theory. So I don't walk in thinking that I'm trying to prove some hypothesis that's pre-made. It's actually in the field, I have to constantly question my own assumptions so that I remain true to what it means to be present in that space. And yet, as you rightly point out, this is also, semi-structured interviews are useful, but they don't get you everything, right? They're not the golden ticket to quality data, right? So for me, there are other things that I pay attention to. So listening to language, right? So how do delegates understand a fish? Is this a product divisible by units to be processed and transshipped? Is a fish a marine genetic resource? Right. So these are not spaces that revere the sanctity of life and how these creatures are integral to broader ecosystems. And so it's really through language that I'm able to help see what are their worldviews that are inhabiting this space, but then also certain things like the organization of space. So who's sitting next to whom can also be very revealing. Like, so for example, I remember one time I was at a meeting of the US delegation to this regional fisheries management organization. And at the head of the table, in addition to the three representatives that organize the committee, so a representative from the industrial sector, a representative from the recreational sector, and a representative from the Department of Commerce, sitting alongside a representative from the Department of State, was a representative from one of the major tuna canneries at the head of the table. And I know I wasn't in a position to sit next to the people who ran the meeting. And so that also communicated something really important about not only who is related to who, but what's the proximity of certain interests to those who are ultimately entrusted to making a decision. And, I think maybe also it's worth mentioning, and I'm seeing this more clearly now that I'm based in Europe, is that oftentimes, right, so ethnography also is quite distant, if not orthogonal to a positivist framework, right? And so for me, my research isn't about producing results, right? It's about figuring out what my findings are, right? So it's not like I'm putting something into a machine, turning the crank, and something comes out of it. It's just that I go to the field and I figure out as best I can what's going on. So it's in many ways, it's also moving away from, I think, an extractivist approach to research where you go in and you mine for data, and that instead, methods here are also about figuring out how to write up your research, right? And understanding that no one can claim themselves as the all-knowing observer and therefore can get away with writing in the third person.
Thank you, Jen. This is really captivating. I would very much like to hear more about the challenges of doing this kind of research. What challenges did you face regarding, for example, issues related to access, positionality in your work?
Yeah, so access to these kinds of institutions is always an issue, right? So, and it's access both in terms of actually getting in, but then it's access in terms of being able to attend the sheer volume of meetings that's required in order to discern those patterns, right? It's very expensive, right? So it requires, not only monies, but also time away from teaching. And so there are practical problems sometimes that also can get in the way. But I think, more broadly, or at least analytically, I think there's also just the general question of, do people in positions of power actually want to be observed over extended periods of time? And they don't. Right. And, I remember, one time a state delegate told me initially that, it's like about trade secrets. And I think it's actually about much more than that. But nonetheless, I think most anthropologists working in the space operate on the margins as accredited observers. They're not embedded in delegations of state, which would open up a whole other range of knowledge production. Even so, I see that not necessarily as a limitation, but an understanding that that too is information that tells me that if, as an ethnographer, I am only allowed to operate on the margins, it's encouraging me to think about, so how is power operating here in ways that don't allow me to access, those other meeting spaces, right? Those delegation rooms, for example. And I recall, maybe this leads into the other question you're asking about positionality. I recall one time I was at the Fiji mission in New York with a bunch of other diplomats from Pacific Island states. And I was with a colleague of mine based here in Europe. And we're sitting around the, table, seminar style. And at the very close of the meeting, one of the delegates leaned in and turned to me and said, "Are you American?" And yeah, I am. And, and it's that recognition that in ethnography, you're more than just an observer in the room, that you're also a participant. And it's in moments like that I could not, just like no one can ever fully escape their positionality. And in this case, I couldn't escape my positionality as a US citizen, as a woman of relative privilege, white by today's standards. So then it's not only what I bring to research, but what others project onto me that also informs what happens in these dynamics, right? And so no form of so-called objectivity can ever neutralize the social fact of that encounter in a field, in an inequitable world, still reeling from colonialism and organized by brute asymmetrical economic power. And I have to be accountable to that when it's time for me to write up and analyze my findings.
This was an episode of research at the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.